Welcome, Jordan Shapiro.
Thank you so much. That was quite an intro. How is everybody? Thanks so much for that intro. I'm really happy to be here. I like this theme, education reimagined, and I want to reimagine some things. I want to talk about what technology tells us about how to reimagine education, how to reimagine school. And I want to start by talking about little kids, okay? Because kids, starting in their very first days in school, they're conditioned to think in ways that align with the tools and the technologies that are all around them. That's the real tech literacy. It's really subtle. It's hidden. It's buried in the everyday structures and routines of the school day. How many of you remember these kinds of worksheets? Okay, 20 past 2, 6:10, 4:25, 8:50. Telling time's a kind of tech literacy. 12:30, 7:15. All of us learned it when we were little. And you know, when I was a kid, digital clocks were still a novelty. They were new. Probably for most of you, they were still pretty new. Clockmakers experimented with what were called jump hour mechanisms like these in the 19th century. But digital clocks, the kind of digital clocks that we're used to today, they didn't become commonplace until the Hamilton Watch Company released this, the Pulsar digital wristwatch. Look at that model, right? Smooth, polished. Look at those red LEDs. That's space age. That's magic. That's modern. But, as we all know, the promise of progress is always balanced with a modicum of technophobia, paranoia, right? When I was a kid, my mother was terrified that digital clocks would make sure none of us could read traditional clocks. I haven't told her yet that my kids can't. They're 10 and 12 years old, my kids. I have 2 boys, and they still count by fives to figure out where the minute hand is. And I think that's okay, actually, because they actually think of time in a much more sophisticated way than I do, or at least than I did at their age. They track multiple time zones on their cell phones and on their laptops, and they do that because they know that if they want to play in a global sandbox, if they want to play in a connected world, they need to know when their friends are awake or asleep in other countries. They need to know when the kids in Bosnia are going to log on to Minecraft. They need to know when they can Skype with someone in Greece. They need to know when they can connect to Discord and talk to people they've met online in the UK. I barely understood the concept of time zones when I was their age. But in the 21st century, children's understanding of time is very different because there's no intrinsically accurate way to think about the flow of time. Believe it or not, time changes. The way humans experience time shifts as we adopt new technologies. And so in each era, what happens is grown-ups teach children not only to develop the knowledge and skills needed to operate specific time measuring tools, but they also teach them clockwork literacy. Okay, they teach them clockwork fluency. Students, kids, they learn to pace their actions. They learn to see their lives in stages. They learn to assess their own successes and failures in ways that are compatible with the current time-telling practices. And all of this learning happens in school. We teach our kids to consider how long it takes to accomplish a task. We celebrate good time management. We proctor tests with a stopwatch. All of the most familiar procedures of education reinforce a specific conception of time. Just think back to your own experience as a primary school kid. Bells, attendance sheets, tardy slips, all these things taught you to think about time in ways that aligned with the industrial era workplace. You learned that labor should be valued by the hour. You learned that time cards should be punched to measure your time at work. You mastered deadlines and punctuality. You tracked progress in semesters or quarters. And yet, when most people consider how we're going to prepare kids for the future, they don't talk about how clocks are changing. They don't acknowledge that our version of timekeeping is the result of a series of technological advances that happened over the past few centuries. So, let's travel back in time, okay? Let's get in our DeLoreans, let's go 88 miles per hour, and let's go back to the beginning of timekeeping. Are you ready? Humans have been tracking time for millennia. They've been building devices to do it. They've built sundials and hour classes and water clocks. These are all technologies that measure duration. They show time passing. They articulate the flow of time, but they don't keep track of synchronized time. Humans didn't agree to coordinate the hours in the day until the 19th century. That happens when we get mechanical clocks, and it's only possible because of something much older called the escapement. Some of you may know a little bit about this. The escapement is a pretty simple piece of mechanical technology. All it does is push a gear forward in tiny increments. And if you imagine, look at that pendulum at the bottom of the clock. Each time it swings from side to side, it moves the gear just one click, right? And it allows it to tell time. Now, the earliest escapements were created by monks who were living in European monasteries around the 13th century. And the clock helped them manage the schedule of prayer and ritual. Right? Monks built the first mechanical clocks, and they did it because they needed to manage their religious agenda. They needed to keep things on schedule. Back in those days, being orderly was the same as being pious or being holy, and clockwork mechanics guaranteed a previously unavailable level of regimentation. It's religious technology, first and foremost. But wait, there's something you should know. The timepieces in medieval monasteries, they didn't look like the ones we have today because they had no minute hands. Because they didn't need the minute hands. Because the monks only wanted to measure 7 periods of time, the canonical hours. Those are the hours decreed by the Vatican about when you're supposed to pray and how often you're supposed to do it. And the abbots and the priors and the friars, they all organized their lives in such a way that they needed the bells and the chimes to communicate precisely when to shift attention. And that's where we get the modern school bell, okay? Which is one of the most ubiquitous and underappreciated education technologies. Well, forget what you've heard about the factory model of education. It's actually the monastery model of education. The bell divides the school day all over the world, okay? It tells students when to change classes, when to go to lunch, when to play outside, when to head home, and most teachers think of it as just an interruption to their lessons, and the students think of it as an opportunity to escape. But I have a very different perspective. When I'm teaching in the classroom, I think of bells as an opportunity. I bring these Tibetan Tingsha bells with me, okay? These bells, these were originally designed for Buddhist monks, for Tibetan monks. They used them in prayer rituals. And I ring them at the beginning of each class. I ring them once the students have already taken their seats, but they're not settled. And something about that bell, that vibration, it works for me the same way it works in the monasteries. It tells the students that it's time to shift attention. Right? It lets them know that we're moving into like a sacred prayer-like space, a thoughtful space, and that they need to leave their social lives outside the door. And they get it. They get it right after a couple of weeks. It only takes a couple of weeks because there's something Pavlovian about it, right? An entire room of 18 and 19-year-old kids, they learn to respond involuntarily to the sound. It's automatic. It just makes them lower their voices and turn towards me, and they make eye contact, and they're completely ready to engage. But I'm going to be honest with you, I didn't come up with this idea. I stole it from a professor that I had in graduate school, and whether he knows it or not, he stole it from medieval monks, okay? Because by the 14th or 15th century, actually everyone had stolen it. All of Europe, all of the world, even outside monasteries, was regulated by church bell technology. Every city had its own bell tower, but it wasn't a clock tower, okay? Because the face, that visual representation of time, that didn't exist yet. That idea of reading a clock, that's not as traditional as you think. The first mechanical clocks, all they did was they told the bell ringer that it was time for him to do his job. As Lewis Mumford once said, one ate not upon feeling hungry, but when one was prompted by the clock, and one slept not when one was tired, but when the clock sanctioned it. Can you imagine living in such an era? Can you imagine it? There would have been so many bells. There's a bell to tell you the market is opening. Ding! Another one tells you it's time to pay taxes. Dong! One meant church was beginning. Ding! And somehow you needed to know the difference between all these bells' distinct sounds. And you would have been able to. You would have been able to just sort of decode them automatically with your ears. You would have learned what each sound represented because it was a necessity. Because one's ability to participate in the community depended on this. But eventually, there were just too many bells, right? There was just too many sounds for the average person to track. That's when they standardized the hours in the day. And instead of a different sound for each activity, there was going to be a different number of chimes for each hour, 24 hours, 12 hours times 2. Why? Because of the zodiac. That's the only reason it's 12. The planet doesn't move in hours. The planet, right? The day's not divided into minutes and seconds. We made that decision. That's a human decision. And that's exactly what we had to do, is then teach everyone how to just abide by that decision. And that's what was happening when my kids began their school career. They sat on the rug in the classroom, they sat in a circle every morning, and they started to talk about the schedule. What happens at 10 a.m., when's recess, when's lunch, when's math. They're learning to comply with a 24-hour clockwork perception of time. Like monks, they're adopting the practice of dividing their day into periods. Like my undergraduate students, they're being trained to shift their attention from one activity to the next. And then after discussing the day's schedule, they always look at the calendar. Right? The teacher taught them how to measure a year. They learned to divide their lives into school days and semesters and spring breaks and summer vacations. They learned to think in harmony with specific tools of the time. But here's the problem. That medieval version of clockwork perception is becoming obsolete. Microsoft Outlook, Google Calendar, they've already altered the way I think about my daily agenda. All day long, notifications compete for my attention. Text messages, tweets, Instagram posts, they ring my smartphone like church bells. I'm no longer tethered to the clock, the mechanical clock, like a monk whose day was organized into these simple devotional periods, because timekeeping has changed, but the monastery model of education has stayed exactly the same. The school day still consists of a collection of clockwork routines. Even online classes, the syllabus remains tied to weeks and to modules and to units and to days and to months. And if you really think about this, the idea that every task should fit into a predetermined period of measured duration is kind of absurd, especially in a digital, nonlinear, connected world. I mean, the ability to focus is important. Of course, the ability to focus is important. In school is where we teach kids how to learn to allocate their attention. But does attention need to be linked to the clock? Focus means hearth. That's what it means in Latin. And it denotes a family gathering place, a sense of community. It has nothing to do with time. Measured duration of focus made sense for a world of monastic clock literacy, where we used a lens to regulate everything, but to bring clarity to our lives. But in the 21st century, interactive engagement happens on a whim. Notifications constantly call for our responses. And we need to learn to live a productive, ethical, fulfilled life, even when our attention is dispersed. We need to master something I like to call drip engagement. Drip engagement means turning your attention to small things as they arise. It means imagining ideas as if they fall from a leaky faucet rather than a pail of water. It means thinking of academic content as if it were delivered like raindrops rather than a deluge. Currently, we flood students with information for fixed durations of time. My youngest son has 35 to 40-minute periods in elementary school. My older one has 60 to 75-minute periods in junior high. And university students are typically expected to engage for somewhere between 90 and 180 minutes. And that's the measure I'm supposed to use when I design online learning activities, too. The assumption is that as people spend more time in school, they adjust to sitting still and focusing for longer periods of time. It's like kneeling for penance, a sacrament. The longer you can bear it, the better you are. And soon, you'll be able to sit quietly at a desk or in a cubicle all day long. And that's one of the first things kids learn during their school careers. They adjust to what it means to be on the clock. Because even in their earliest years, we're already preparing them for jobs, as we should be, but work is changing. The popularity of messaging platforms like Slack and Microsoft Teams tells us drip engagement will be what the workplace of the future demands. Forget the old 9-to-5 office model. Soon employees will be able to contribute from anywhere at any hour. Many already do. How many of you have received emails from work or responded to them while at this conference? I'm impressed for those of you who don't have your hands up. In 2016, Gallup reported that 43% of workers in the United States complete at least some of their job responsibilities at home. And in 2017, 3.9 million US workers telecommuted more than half the time. Those numbers are only going to increase. And that means that Folks with an acumen for dispersed focus will soon have a competitive professional advantage. Soon, educators will need to adopt a distributed approach. The monastery model prepared us for the episodic agendas of the industrial age, but the drip routines of the new classroom will need to function as practice for the conventions of a connected workplace. I should tell you that I borrowed this drip language. I borrowed this term, this imagery of drip. I borrowed it from online marketers. They use the term dripping campaign to describe the way an automated advertising process can guide customers from web browsing to a final sale. If you think about when you search for something online and then you put it in your cart, but you don't click the button, and then you get an email a few days later asking you if you still want to buy it, that's all part of a sort of drip campaign, right? With each search term, you embark on a journey, on a buyer's journey, and all the information you need is now going to show up exactly when you need it. And we're used to this. We're used to this because of e-commerce and browser cookies and predictive algorithms. We've all become accustomed to drip campaigns. Social media too, right? It's made drip campaigns a regular part of our lives, and that has the potential to change the way we learn. But unfortunately, we often think of it as something frivolous, right? We equate those short utterances, the tweet, as something that's superficial, a distraction. But kids know that nothing's complete after just one tweet. They go on with the same thread for days, weeks on ends. Their attention is disseminated, but it's not limited. Snapchat actually knows this. They've embraced the user's desire for drip engagement, and they added a snap streak emoji. Okay, and what that is a badge that celebrates consecutive snaps sent among the same group of friends. I love this, actually. I love this because Snapchat started as a platform that was like rooted in impermanence. It was a way to send nude photos, right, and have them disappear as soon as they were gone. There was sexting, right, and it was this sort of celebration of a single moment in time, and now it's become the whole status of it depends on the length of a streak. The status now depends on longevity. It depends on drip-like continuity. Just imagine what learning could look like when teachers adopt this drip model of time and attention and continuity, and when they adopt what digital technology has already brought into our lives. They're going to think of a tweet, like a sentence, as a small part of a deep contextual engagement with an idea. They're going to design learning activities that leverage ongoing disseminated focus. They're going to teach students to see the time between each utterance as a space for exploring new concepts, trying on different perspectives, doing research, incorporating new data. The challenge, the only challenge, I think, is changing how we think about attention. See, right now, we associate focus with measured periods of attention. We don't realize that the clockwork era is the original culprit for dividing up our concentration. Church bells were the first thing that interrupted our thinking. Church bells are what asked monks to shift their focus, even if their thoughts remained incomplete. But historically and culturally, clockwork thinking was not what everybody used. If you compare this interrupted clockwork thinking to the deep intellectual engagement that Plato gives us in the dialogues of Socrates, we get these accounts of all-day philosophical engagements with a singular idea. Drip engagement is the norm. Symposium literally means eating and drinking with friends. Right? And the book Symposium tells the story of an all-night party in which friends take turns making arguments about the nature of love. They stop to eat, they stop to dance, they stop to laugh, but they never lose focus. Likewise, if you look at many indigenous people, they participate in non-episodic models of attention. They practice place rather than time-based engagements with ideas. The famous beat poet Gary Snyder once wrote an essay about his experience driving around Western Australia with an Aboriginal Pintubi elder. The old man speaks so fast. That's how he described it. He said he speaks so fast, he's telling rapid-fire stories of the hills and the mountains and the trees and the rocks and the birds in the stand, and Gary Snyder can barely keep up with this onslaught of information until finally he realizes that the problem is not the elder, right? The problem is the truck's engine. They were stories to be told through walking, and the vehicle forced their conversation into the logic of a mechanical clock. The Pintubi don't think of it wisdom that way. They don't teach it that way. They do all of their learning differently. They do it through cycles of journey songs, stories about special places and teaching spots. They use space rather than time to organize their education. The elders walk the landscape with the young people, and they tell stories as they pass each natural landmark. It's a kind of drip engagement. Focus is disseminated, and connected concepts present in response to the physical landscape. Ideas are shared whenever physical notifications arrive. To reimagine education, we're going to need to reconsider what it means to be present. Presence, right? Our current concept of focus derives from monastic life. We consider episodic attention to be sacred, to be holy, to be pure. And when we do it well, when we concentrate our focus on the right activities, we feel good about ourselves, right? You feel great when you're focused for a long time. That whole popular backlash against multitasking, that's all part of this. This is part of a leftover medieval fairy tale that's like deep down in our psyches, telling us that we're supposed to act like elite monks from the Middle Ages because supposedly they were morally superior people. And now we try to teach our children to focus the way they did. But that's not what today's students really need. We need to be teaching them to embrace drip engagement. We need to be helping them cultivate focusing skills for a new economic and technological context. If you don't mind, I'm going to say just a few more words. I just want to say a few more words about the implications of this changing conception of time on education. And if you'll just picture for a second a typical kindergarten classroom, the books and the toys and the letters and the numbers. This one I pulled off Google Images, but it's similar to what it looked like when my kids were in kindergarten, and their teacher, actually the same teacher who taught them to tell time, she'd come into the class in the morning. She came in actually one particular morning, and she complains that the rug on the floor, that it's filthy and that it's stained. Now, adults may not realize this, but for little kids, rugs are a really big deal. Okay, because when you're 5 or 6, you spend so much time on the floor. Your school day is divided into desks and playgrounds and blocks and tables and sandboxes and things, but then you come together on the floor at multiple times during the day. The rug is like home base. It's like the center of a kid's world. And so when the teacher complains about the rug, the kids pay attention, right? It piques their interest. So she walks in one day. She walks in and she looks down and she scowls at the floor and she shakes her head in disappointment. This is a true story, by the way. She shakes her head in disappointment and she pulls out her phone. Okay, she pulls out her phone and she pretends to dial the rug store. And the kids are like, "Get a green one! Polka dots! I like red! I love red! How come he gets to pick? I want to pick! That's not fair!" And she puts her index finger right in front of her lips, and they all quiet down instantly. I swear, they just quiet, because she's an expert at classroom management. She doesn't need Tingshaw bells. She's got it under control. And once they're all calm, she tells the guy on the phone, the pretend guy on the phone, she tells him, "I need a new rug." And I don't know what he said, but she gets confused by whatever he says, and she looks worried, and she looks at the kids. And she whispers, "He wants to know what size rug, how big. What do I tell him?" And the kids have these blank stares. They have these puzzled faces, like 5- and 6-year-old faces, completely puzzled. They're trying to figure out, how do you communicate length and width over the phone? What unit of measurement do you use? Do you use sneakers or pencils or crayons or blocks? What symbolic metric's going to be consistent between their classroom and a rug store? And the kids only need to think about this for a few minutes. And then it clicks. It's just like magic. It suddenly clicks. They get it. They discovered the need for standardized units of measurement. And the teacher hands them out yardsticks and rulers, and they get initiated into this new way of being and this new way of thinking. And they start measuring everything because they just learned a new philosophical outlook, right? They just learned a thought tool with which to organize and perceive the entire physical world around them. And with this, the stage is now set for multiplication and division and fractions and geometry and physics and chemistry and engineering. You get the point. Because rugs are not the only thing we measure. We measure everything. We measure time, right? And through the routines of the classroom, students even learn to measure their own sense of self. They learn to evaluate their successes and failures using clock-like intervals. And this happens in subtle ways, okay? For example, when my kids were really little, not anymore, but when they were really little, I would bake them cupcakes that they could take to school on their birthday. And I learned some things about it. I learned that more frosting is better than less. I learned that candy on top was fantastic, and they would get all big smiles while they passed the treats out to their classmates. But what never occurred to me until much later was that these confections were part of a way of perceiving the world. Because celebrating birthdays, believe it or not, is a kind of tech literacy. And when I was their age, I learned it, and you learned it, but not my grandmother. My grandmother never learned it. My grandmother had to adapt. For her, birthdays were as unfamiliar as the radio and the television and the airplane. She didn't even know when her real birthday was, my grandmother. For her entire life, she just guessed her age. And the reason is because growing up in Polish Lithuania, back before there was centralized government bureaucracy, she needed to, there was no office in her rural village where they could go get the birth certificate. They had to walk to town to get the birth certificate. And her mother and her father, they weren't willing to do it until all the kids were born. So my grandmother and all of her sisters had the same birthday. Okay? And I thought that was the craziest thing when I was a kid, because I had grown up conditioned by school to believe in episodic time and to believe in the monastic model of education. It made no sense to me, but the average life, the way we experience it, was a brand new concept in the 19th century. For most of human history, just think about this, the death of a child was an everyday occurrence. And when mortality can arrive as suddenly for kids as it does for adults, age becomes much less relevant because there's no standard lifespan. Right? My grandmother couldn't take it for granted the way I do, that barring some unforeseen tragedy, I'll live for, as close to a century as possible. And that wasn't because she lived in a poor village in the middle of nowhere. That was nobody ever expected to live for 70 or 80 or 90 years before modern medicine made that plausible. Right? Old age happened, of course, old age happened, but in general, folks accepted that they were just as likely to pass away at 14 as 49. And therefore, they couldn't think of childhood as a time in which you prepare for adulthood. Grown-up years need to be guaranteed before humans can perceive them as the primary part of life. Imagine a world in which age has so little authority. If you think of all of history's child prodigies and teen kings and all of that, they're all a product of that mindset. We're usually told that young people used to do more because the lifespan was shorter, but that's not precisely true. It's really because adulthood wasn't so significant. This very idea of things like puberty and adolescence, these transitional periods on the way to adulthood, they're a peculiar part of our present era. And all the developmental milestones, these standard increments and stages with which we measure our time on the planet, these are products of the 19th and 20th centuries. They're just like the clock's 24 hours. The universe doesn't necessarily agree with them. These aren't written into the cells of our bodies. These are just useful categories that we use to measure duration and progression. And while right now it makes perfect sense for us to organize our lives around grade levels and birthdays and sweet 16s and midlife crises, the big schedules of our lifetimes are ultimately just elements of clock literacy. They didn't exist until there was a reason for our experiences to be regulated by the mechanical clock. That reason arrived around the 1820s when railroad timetables forced us to set our bell towers so that they were synchronized in places that were far away. That's when we suddenly had time zones and minute hands and a new sense of simultaneity. Individuals needed their own pocket watches, right? They needed their own alarm clocks. And children needed to learn how to live with immediacy. They needed to learn how to operate in a world that measured duration in seconds. They needed to understand that life ticked away in progressive measured stages. They needed to see the world from the perspective of the predominant technology. But that technology is changing. And now it's our task to make sure that people can think beyond the limits of industrial age clockwork literacy. We are actively outsourcing chronological thinking to intelligent machines. And therefore success and happiness and fulfillment is soon going to depend on one's ability to think outside of a linear timetable. And therefore, as educators, we all need to design our routines accordingly. Thank you.
You always say that you wanna be free.
You come running back.
Said you would, baby.
You come running
Said
back.
it so many times before.
You come running back.
Running
to me.
Oh, time is on.
Time is on my side.
Yes, it is.
Time is on my side.
Yes, it is. You searching for good times, but oh, just wait and see. Yes.
You come running
I
back.
don't have to worry no more.
You come running
Spend the rest of my life with you, baby.
Come
Running back to me.
to me.
Hey, hey. Yes, you will. Go ahead, baby. Go ahead. Line up the town. Baby, do everything your heart desires. And remember, I will always be around. And I know, like I told you so many times before, it'll come back, baby. It'll come back, baby. Knocking at my door. Time is on my side. Listen.
Is on my side.
Oh, yes, it is now. Yes. Time is
on my side.
Oh, yes, it is. See, 'cause I got the real loving, the kind that you need.
You come running back.
Said I said you would, baby.
Come
I always said you would now.
come
Running